Is there a social class structure in your country? In the UK, many people are very aware of social class and their place in society. We're speaking about class today. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés con Reza y Craig.
Hello, I'm Craig.
And hi, I'm Reza.
And together with over 45 years of teaching between us to all different classes, we're going to help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are you doing, Reza?
I'm fine, Craig. I'm feeling well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well. Actually, we teach two different classes and in classes because we teach in class. We teach English classes.
You could say that Craig and I have seen a few classes in our time. We certainly have.
So before we look at some vocabulary and expressions connected to the class system, let's look at what the class system actually is. Reza, how would you describe the class system? Can you think of a definition for the class system in case people don't know exactly what it is?
Well, obviously, this is not a clear cut. That means 100% obvious and everyone agrees. And you can anger people. You can cause offense if you don't get it right. But let's say it's something like when people are grouped into a group of social categories, depending on hierarchy. So some people are above, some people in the middle, some at the bottom, etc. So the most common expressions in English are upper, the top, middle, and then at the bottom, lower classes. So a hierarchical social system, let's say.
Yeah, upper class, middle class, and lower class. And then I think you can subdivide that into upper middle class or lower middle class.
Yes, and even more. Those are very typical. Those are very common distinctions to divide the middle class. But you can go further if you want. You can divide upper lower class and lower class. Yep. And then you can even talk about people who are at the very bottom, maybe even below the lower classes. But we'll get to that in a minute.
So looking at the lower class system in the UK, working class are sometimes called blue collar workers. Collar, C-O-L-L-A-R, cuello. So if you're wearing a blue collar, the idea is that you're probably doing manual work. You're working with your hands. So working class, blue collar workers. Sometimes they're called the proletariat, the lower classes.
Although the word proletariat for me is almost a technical word, not quite, but it's more to do with politics,
Marxism.
Socioeconomic, but things like Marxism, communism, they talked about the rise and the power of the proletariat. So it can sound a bit outdated or inappropriate these days, don't you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think blue collar worker, lower class or working class are more common.
Yeah, blue collar you mentioned because that will be the color of someone doing a manual job, because they'll be wearing possibly overalls. Might not be a word that you know. Overalls are clothes that you put over all your other clothes. Mm-hmm. So that's why they're called overalls, Overalls. And traditionally, they're blue.
Right. And going up to the middle class, we have the expression white collar workers, because if you're wearing a white collar, you probably work in an office, you have a clerical job, or you're working in a bank. So you're a white collar worker.
There's another word for that, which comes from French, the bourgeoisie. Well, it's not quite the same. White collar workers just means people who have jobs where you wear shirts, for example. But bourgeoisie is the idea of the comfortable class. I think of comfort. I think of people who are doing okay. If they're the bourgeoisie, the lower classes, the working classes, they're not doing too well. They really need to work hard to survive. But if you're from the bourgeoisie, the idea is that you've got a little bit of extra money to spend. You might have piano lessons. Maybe you go on holiday from time to time. You're doing okay, yeah? You're the bourgeoisie.
Yeah. So also in this group, you could use the expression professional classes. So people who are working. These days, it's possibly the husband and the wife working. So there are two incomes in the family. a couple of cars outside, perhaps, as Reza said, a holiday or two every year, and professional classes will be a way to describe people in the middle class who have professional jobs, the white-collar workers.
Yes, although I think perhaps the meaning of this word has changed over the years. The way Craig has described it, there is a contemporary meaning of that word. But I think if you go back about 40 or 50 years and beyond, professional classes really only refer to certain professions, not all.
For example, lawyers, doctors,
right,
insurance, those
teachers,
kind of professions.
Police officers.
Yeah.
Steady jobs for life where you needed a reasonable amount of education or training to get in. And they were considered to merit a certain respect, that type of thing. But if you worked as a waiter all your life, it was your profession, you couldn't have said you were in the professional classes. Perhaps these days, but in the past, no. If you weren't one of those traditional respected jobs, you weren't of the professional classes. You were simply working class.
Right. Of course, these days you'd have to include people working in IT, information technology, as professional middle class people. And we didn't mention any professions for working class people, trades, plumbers, electricians, builders, bakers, perhaps.
You can already see, listeners, that it's complicated. Craig mentioned electricians. In most countries I know, Britain, Ireland, Germany, Spain, electricians earn a hell of a lot of money. I'm not joking. A lot more than a teacher per hour. They honestly do. So yeah, they're considered working class, but they tend to have a lot of money. It's become very confusing these days.
It's going to get complicated later because I'm not sure that the classes are divided or classified according to how much money you earn. So let's leave that for later because that gets a bit complicated. I'll be interested to know what Reza thinks on that. Let's move to the upper classes, the elite or the aristocracy, sometimes called the ruling classes, perhaps the top 1 or 2% of the population are in this class, and they're the people who generally run the country. They're the people who are in government, in high levels of banking and investment.
If you're listening to us from South America, you might have a better understanding of this than we do in Europe, because I believe in quite a few countries in South America, although things are changing, but in quite a few countries in America, 1 or 2 or 5% of the population own about 80 or 90% of the wealth. It's much more extreme than Europe even. Although generally in the world that's the case, but South America is very extreme.
Another expression is nouveau riche. Did I pronounce that correctly? Nouveau riche? The new rich?
Worse, we need Pilar from France. Pilar in France, not from France. Are we pronouncing it right, Pilar?
Nouveau riche, the people who were not born into money, so they acquired it, they earned it, and they managed to move up social classes by getting more money over time. So they're classed as the nouveau riche.
And are they accepted like any other upper class person? Or would you say there's any distinction there, Craig?
My feeling is they are looked down upon by people who were born into the upper class. The phrasal verb to look down on or look down upon someone is to look at someone with a bad view or to think badly of someone for some reason. So like you look down your nose at someone and think they are inferior to you. Do you agree with that? That the nouveau riche are looked down upon by people born into a higher social class?
By some of them, yes. Craig's talking about old money. Old money doesn't just mean the actual money. It can refer to the people who have the money. So old money are upper class people who've always had money. So they're not nouveau riche. They're not new. They're old money. They don't really like the nouveau riche because they don't like new people getting into their upper class, I suppose.
And you don't necessarily have to be rich to be upper class, which is what we mentioned before. In the UK, though, I think it's a bit different, isn't it? In the way that people look at upper class people in the UK.
I would say in the UK, money isn't that important as regards generalizing about someone's class. I think in the UK, people listen to accent more and are more interested in your thoughts and what you know. Whereas in America, I think it is more based on money. What would you say?
Yeah, I agree. I think you can not have a lot of money but still be upper class. And people who are born into money, I don't think have the same value of money as, in generally speaking, as those who have made money and worked up to the upper class.
For example, nearly all British prime ministers that I can think about in modern times have been well educated. They went to university, etc., studied. They're pretty clever people, at least academically. But in America, there have been American presidents who weren't particularly academic.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in the UK, it'd be quite hard to be able to do that because we associate a good level of education with the ruling class as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's very true. If you are upper class, you might be called posh, P-O-S-H, which is pijo or pija in Spanish. It's an adjective. So you are a posh person. You appear posh to other people. Do you know any posh people?
I do. I'd prefer not to name them, but I do.
Okay, they might listen to the podcast.
And I hope they do. I have nothing against posh people. Or snobs, which is not quite the same. You could translate snob as pijo as well. A snob is a noun, though. Posh is an adjective. But snob means someone who thinks they're really great, thinks they're better than they are. And they might be, very rich, or they might be, socially in a good position. But that doesn't mean that it's the reality is as good as they think. For me, posh and snob are not quite the same. The Queen is posh. You can't get much posher than the Queen, but she isn't a snob. She doesn't think she's better than she is. She's the Queen, for goodness sake. She is posh, but she's not a snob. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can also be a snob about a particular thing. We recently did a podcast episode on wine. So if you are a wine snob, maybe you think you know a lot about wine, or maybe you do. But somebody who doesn't know a lot about wine might call you a wine snob. For example, I think I'm a coffee snob because I'm very, very fussy, very particular, very fussy and special about the coffee I drink. So I could call myself a coffee snob, for example.
And I'm quite snobbish or snobby. Two adjectives exist. I have a certain snobbishness or snobbery, the noun, about beer. So maybe I'm a beer snob. As Craig will vouch, I think it surprises him sometimes.
What does vouch mean?
Vouch means he will testify that it's true. I usually say when I ask for a beer in Spain, I say, "Que cerveza tenéis?" I'm not going to drink any old beer. Maybe I'm a beer snob. If it's going to be Heineken, I don't want that.
I don't think you're a beer snob, because if we went to a bar that didn't have beer that you particularly liked, you would not say to me, "I'm not staying here. Let's go to another place." And I think that's the difference between a snob and if there was really bad coffee, I might say, "Do you mind if we go to a place that has better coffee?" I might say that, but you would not. You would sit there and you would drink a beer even if you didn't particularly like it. So no, you're not a snob. We should mention the schools because of the difference between public school and private schools in the UK. So public schools tend to be the elite schools. Do you agree with that, Reza? They tend to be the ones like Eton and Rugby and maybe Cambridge and Oxford, schools that perhaps the upper classes pay for. And it's confusing because they're called public schools, but they're not actually run by the government. Schools run by the government are state schools.
Yes, so public school is a type of private school, confusingly. Another type of private school is a prep school. Prep is short for proprietary. In a prep school, it's basically a primary school where you pay a lot of money to send your kids with the understanding that after that prep school, they'll go to a posh school, possibly an elite public school after that.
Let's look at some nicknames for upper class and lower class people. We can call an upper class person a toffee-nosed person, toffee-nosed, or upper class twits, T-W-I-T-S. These are all they could be very offensive, so be careful when and where you use them. They tend to be used by the people of the opposite class. So maybe a working class person would call an upper class person an upper class twit, a toff, T-O-F-F, with a plummy accent, a hooray Henry, or a la-di-da, because they're very posh. La-di-da. Fancy pants is another one, or swanky, hoity-toity. You can see a list of all these words in the show notes at inglespodcast.com/216.
And what about the lower classes, Craig? How would the upper classes make fun of the lower classes?
Well, they could call them chavs, CHAVS, oiks, or plebs, the masses, just the general common people, the lower orders. And again, these can be offensive. So please be very, very careful when and where you use them.
They can be offensive or they can be fun. Depends on the context, but be careful.
So moving on to some expressions with talking about classes. To feel insecure. Sometimes you're in a particular situation that is not typical to your class, and that might cause you to feel insecure. Can you ever remember, Reza, a time when you felt insecure in a social situation because of the class difference?
Oh, many times. Many times in my life. I still do from time to time. So many times I wouldn't have enough time to mention them all. But hasn't it ever happened to you?
It has, yeah, a few times. Another expression for upper class people is to be born with a silver spoon in your mouth. That refers specifically to the accent, the way people speak. So if you listen to the BBC or the Queen of England, they speak with RP, which is received pronunciation, a very certain way of pronouncing words and vowel sounds. And only 2 or 3% of the population of the UK speak with this accent. But if you do, you're probably upper class and you're born with a silver spoon in your mouth. You get all the privileges of public school education.
If you're not one of those people, though, and you find yourself surrounded by those people, you might be out of your depth or out of your league. That means you're in a social circle or any atmosphere that you aren't used to and you feel inferior in some way, out of your depth or league.
That did happen to me once. My dad used to work for the South African embassy. He was a chauffeur and he drove the South African ambassador in London. And once I walked in to see him and the ambassador was in the room and he presented me to him. And I felt very uncomfortable because this man was obviously a much, much higher class than I was. And I felt very uncomfortable, very self-conscious, very insecure, and a lovely man who's very friendly, very nice. But I really did feel self-conscious in that situation.
Around about what year was this, roughly?
This was after apartheid had finished. So it was around about Nelson Mandela time.
Right. Craig saw me come in there from afar. He knew where I was going with my question. Was it pre or post apartheid?
No, it's post apartheid. Yeah,
yeah. Because I was going to say,
but just post apartheid, really, just like a few years after.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to say to Craig, if he had said, "Oh, it was 1980 something," I don't know, pre apartheid, I would have said to him, "If you felt uncomfortable, imagine how I would have felt." Because according to South African law, I would have been immediately inferior by law to the president pre-apartheid. I guess I would have had to say, hello, I'm a Cape Colour. I suppose I would have had to call myself because in South Africa, they actually had a system of legally classifying people into white Cape Colours or kind of Asians in the middle and blacks at the very bottom and a few others.
So what are the aspiring classes? You can aspire to be someone or to be a particular class in society. So if you want to be a higher class, you can be part of the aspiring classes. A social climber, someone who takes advantage of people or situations to rise in social stature, in social structure. A social climber.
But social climber doesn't sound good. Whereas to be from the aspiring classes, that sounds okay. That's positive.
Yeah.
You want to better yourself, as they say. But if you're a social climber, it's like, oh, watch out, he's a social climber. He'll use you to get where he's going. You know, we don't like social climbers. Social mobility is an interesting and common collocation. It's a subject that fascinates me. It's the ability to change from one social class to another. And I can't resist but put in a bit of trivia here. And I did check just to make sure that my gut feeling, what I basically thought was true, and it is. that most serious studies agree that social mobility in the UK is without any doubt, believe me, less possible than it used to be about 40 to 70 years ago. Craig's smirking. He doesn't really believe me, I don't think. But
it makes sense.
True.
No, I do believe you.
Yeah, I tell you, it's astounding. But look at posh newspapers, papers for the plebs. Look at reports from Cambridge, Oxford, whatever you want, and they all agree that the golden age of social mobility in the United Kingdom, not Spain, very different story, in the UK was about 1950 to 80. From about 1980 approximately onwards, it became harder to go from one social class, particularly upwards. It's probably quite easy to go down if you want, but to go from lower class to middle class or middle to upper became harder after 1980.
But how do you do that? How do you change classes?
Good question. I would say above all, getting a good education. And what has happened perhaps in the UK is that the elite schools have stayed in place, and schools which there was a greater variety of schools before that, but now they're being polarized. The good schools are very good and the bad ones are terrible. And so it's quite hard to get away from the bottom once you're there, I think.
But let's say, for example, you're born working class and you want to be upper class. Can you have a working class education and then re-educate yourself, change your accent and move up the classes?
Can be done. People have done it, but not easy. It's not easy. For example, they've investigated into the cabinet, el gabinete, and it doesn't matter if it's the right-wing Conservative Party or the left-wing Labour Party. It's exactly the same. They've studied and seen that the number of people who went to public school in the cabinet is much higher these days than it was in the 60s or 70s. It's actually higher. It's harder to get into government now if you didn't go to public school than 40 or 50 years ago, which I find really depressing.
It's interesting though. But I suppose you could also earn money and become part of the nouveau riche. That would bring you up the social ladder, escalera. Or you could marry into a higher class. That's another way to go to a higher class, I suppose.
Yes, you might be upwardly mobile is a collocation you hear that when you're going from one social class to another. Or you could be unlucky and be downwardly mobile. Craig, do you believe that reverse snobbery exists? What is it?
Let's describe it first. Reverse snobbery. We said before that a snob is a person who thinks they know a lot about something. Maybe they're slightly better than another person. They put themselves above other people in certain aspects. Well, reverse snobbery is to be very, very proud and happy to be a lower class status, so that you dislike or resent the higher classes and you're very, very happy where you are. Yeah, of course that exists. Absolutely. I believe that. And I know people who are reverse snobs. I don't think I am. I think that I'm very respectful and maybe a bit envious of the higher classes, coming from a working class background. But yeah, definitely I know people who are very proud of who they are and where they come from.
I think it's an idea that was very strong, particularly in the United Kingdom. I'm sure it exists in other countries as well in different forms, but it was a very strong thing in the United Kingdom until perhaps the 70s, 80s, it began to be less noted. But, in working class areas, let's say where everybody was a coal miner or worked in a shipyard or something like that, a very common feeling was we don't like toffs. We don't like laddie-dab people coming here telling us what to do. You can clear off, go back where you came from.
Absolutely. Yeah.
People were happy with that. Now, I don't think that's so common, but it was a very strong British tradition in certain parts of the UK. The industrial areas, right?
In fact, yeah, I'm very interested at the moment. I'm watching a series on Netflix called Peaky Blinders, and that's based around the Birmingham area and working class people in Birmingham who were very proud of their roots, where they come from, very close-knit society. Close-knit means connected very strongly, very integrated society, very defensive, and very proud of the working class roots that they have. By the way, if you have Netflix, you might be interested in watching this series, Peaky Blinders. I'll put a link in the show notes. It's very good for your English to listen to these accents because you get a variety of accents, working class and upper class.
Craig, do you hear much about the landed gentry these days?
Only when they speak about fox hunting and changing countryside laws.
Exactly.
Upper class people who own land, so we say they are landowners, and this land and huge houses and estates get passed on from generation to generation. So they inherit the land that they live on and hunt on.
At the other end of the scale, people who live below the poverty line, that means they earn or they have so little that they face financial hardship, difficulty. People who live below the poverty line, such as the marginal classes, that's very lower class people below the poverty line. They may or may not even have a house or somewhere to sleep. They're kind of on the edge, the margins. Or the working poor, who are ever more common these days, particularly in countries like Spain. They're people who have a job, but they're still very poor. They discovered that after the financial crisis of 2008 or 9, the number of working poor all over Europe increased dramatically, but particularly in countries like Spain, where people were working, they had full-time jobs, working many hours, but they had barely enough money to pay the bills. That was not common 20 years ago, but it's become quite common again, sadly.
Yeah, there are a lot of people who are working really hard, but because salaries are dropping, they don't have enough money to make ends meet. The expression to make ends meet means enough money to live comfortably, to buy food, to rent accommodation, to have a roof over your head. It's getting more difficult for the working poor to make a living in some European countries. At the other end of the scale, we have the idle rich. So these are very rich people that were perhaps born into money, into their class, and they don't need to work because they have inherited money. So to be idle means not to do anything, just to sit around, maybe ride a horse, and don't do anything. They don't need to do anything to survive. And this also goes together with the landed gentry. There's a very extended royal family in the UK that get public money to be idle just because they have a title after their name. And a lot of people who own land are in this situation.
That doesn't mean that all idle rich people are wasting time doing nothing. And I'd like to apologize if a good friend of mine's listening, the Marquise of Peru. I apologize to her if she thinks I'm referring to her as the idle rich. She's not. Caste is another interesting word used to describe social groups. That's C-A-S-T-E at the end. You don't expect that to be pronounced like that. You expect it's going to be caste, don't you? But it's not. Yeah. It's caste. C-A-S-T-E. That's strange pronunciation. What is a caste, Craig?
It's a social system where everything is organized or classified according to a certain social structure. So people are born into a particular caste and they can't get out of it. It's not like you can earn money and work your way up to a higher caste. If you're born in a particular caste, you stay there for the rest of your life. Whatever you do and however you manage to live your life. It's really, really common in India. It's a very strong part, a very prominent, huge part of the social system in India and other countries. And the lowest of the lowest are known as untouchables. And they do the very menial, the lowest work possible in society. Obviously. And you can't cross marry, can you? You can't marry someone from a different caste. You have to marry within your caste.
Obviously, that's a very controversial word. Untouchable, so low that you shouldn't touch them because they might be dirty. That is sadly the way they're described in India. But be careful if you're going to use that word.
Yeah. So we can classify a person by the way they speak English in Britain. Your vocabulary can show what social background, what social class you're in. So I thought it would be interesting to look at some pairs of words and for Reza and I to say which one we would use and if it reflects our social class. But before that, what social class would you consider yourself to be?
Extremely complicated. Well, you did ask, Greg. Basically, I would say I grew up, I spent most of my time in a working class Belfast environment, because the area where my parents lived and where their house is still today is definitely a working class area of Belfast. There's a lot of people in that area who are the working poor. There's plenty of people who live off welfare payment. They don't have a job. They're unemployed. It's a housing estate. That's what you would call vivienda de protección social. A lot of the houses in the area, not all of them, not ours, but some of them are. So that's where I grew up. Having said that, my dad, who comes from India, was certainly not one of the so-called untouchables, lucky for him and me, but was pretty posh. My dad's family from India were landowners. I wouldn't say not the landed gentry. No, they were landed. Yes, they inherited land, but they were very uneducated. In fact, my grandparents on my father's side were basically illiterate. That means they couldn't read or write, but they did have land, and land means money. So yeah, they were fairly well off.
So they had social status. What if you asked your mum what her social class is? What do you think she would say?
I wouldn't ask her because I think she'd be annoyed, but I would have to say...
Why would she be annoyed?
Well, in my opinion, my mum comes from a line of working class Belfast people. There's no doubt about it, really. My grandfather worked in a shipyard, una astillería. I mean, as a manual worker. My grandmother, when she was very young, worked in a textile factory. Very hard manual labor.
Manual work, blue collar work.
I don't know if she went to school much past 15 or 16. Mm-hmm. Neither of my grandparents, actually on either side, went to university. So strange. On the Indian side, money, but not educated. On the Belfast side, a bit more educated, but not very educated, but not illiterate, but definitely working class. A strange mixture.
Yeah.
A strange mixture.
Interesting. Yeah, so it's not clear cut. It's not obvious. Yeah.
There are a few of us around, not many, but probably the result of the British Empire. Mm-hmm. The case of the Spanish Empire has been a bit different because it was such a long time ago. You can't really so much see such contrast. But because the British Empire only really ended about 70 or 80 years ago, there are people like me who are kind of made up of different bits of what was the British Empire, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
What about you? What would you say you're?
Well, my parents were working class. My dad left school at 14 and he worked in London Market, in Covent Garden Market. So he didn't really have an education, but he managed to work his way up. And before I was born, my parents moved from the centre of London, the East End of London, quite a working class area of Whitechapel, Mile End. And they moved out to the suburbs. So when I was born, I had, I think, a kind of a lower middle class upbringing. So I consider myself lower middle class.
If you're going to be exact, then I guess my Belfast upbringing was largely what I would call upper working class. And I'm not trying to be funny. At the kind of the top end of working class, but, you know, maybe almost at the bottom end of middle class as well, somewhere in the middle there, between where lower class or working class meets middle class, round about there.
Well, actually, then, you saying that, I'm not sure if I'm lower middle class or upper working class, because I didn't go to university. I left school at 17. I travelled. I worked in insurance, so I had white-collar jobs for many years in working as a civil servant, working in insurance. But I also worked in construction for a while to earn money. So it's. Can you begin to see, can you understand now how difficult it is sometimes for British people to classify their class? Because it brings in the parents, it brings in the work you did, the area you grew up, if you went to university or not. Very complicated. Anyway, what do you think? What would you say, Reza, to these pairs of words? Booze or alcohol? I think it's obvious which is a working class word and which is a maybe a higher class word.
I would, in a social context, normally say booze.
Me too.
For me, alcohol's quite technical.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. If I was invited to a party and I wanted to ask if there were going to be alcoholic beverages there, I would probably say, is there going to be booze at the party? I wouldn't use the word alcohol.
And if you're very upper class and a bit silly, a bit of an upper class twit, you might say, will there be cocktails?
Champagne? Will we be drinking bubbles? One that I think clearly marks upper class and lower class people is toilet or lavatory. I've always said toilet. I would never imagine saying lavatory, although I understand that's an upper class word, because I hear people who have been to Cambridge and Oxford and public schools who would say lavatory instead of toilet.
Yeah, for me, lavatory's posh as well. I would sometimes say toilet, but more often than not, I actually say bathroom. I think I've been influenced a lot by American English. Where
that's an Americanism, yeah.
I say that. Or sometimes loo. Mm-hmm. And I read up about the word loo, and apparently loo's considered very posh.
Is it?
Yeah, but posh slang. It's the slang of the upper classes. So the Queen might say to Prince Philip, Philip, I'm just off to the loo.
Oh, Philip, I'm just off to the loo.
Yeah, it's posh slang. But I say it sometimes myself.
And although I might not say, well, I would not say lavatory, I might say lav. I'm just going to the lav. So I'd shorten the word to say that I'm going to the toilet. Our next two words, serviette or napkin. When you're having a meal, servieta in Spanish. So would you say serviette or napkin? And which one do you think is posher?
I say serviette, but I know napkin's posher.
Mm-hmm.
But I've just always said serviette.
I've said, yeah, same here, serviette. So I think we're probably both lower classes, Grissa, me and you. So napkin, I think, is more likely to be cloth, like linen, and a serviette could possibly be paper.
Well, funny. I always say serviette, but at home I never use paper. I always use cloth.
Me too.
But I call it serviette.
Me too. I still call it a serviette, yeah. Postre, would you say sweet or pudding?
Definitely neither.
What would you say?
Dessert.
Yeah.
I would neither say, I would never say either of those. What about you?
No, I agree. I would say dessert. But what do you think is posher, sweet or pudding?
For me, pudding sounds posher.
Yeah. Pudding is more likely to be said by upper class people and sweet by working class. Sweet or maybe afters. Have you heard that word?
Oh,
afters.
That's very posh. I like that.
No, it's actually, I think it's working class.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
To me, it sounds posh.
What's for afters?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's just nothing. You'd never hear it in Ireland. So I guess I have no context to judge it by. In Ireland, no one would say afters, but I have heard it. Yeah.
It might be something that's typical of working class London, but I have heard it growing up. I heard it growing up in London. Yeah. Afters. See, what's for afters?
Let's put it into different accents. See if it works. So a posh person, would they say, what's for afters? Or is it more like, what's for afters, mate?
What's for afters?
But yeah, the second one sounds more right, doesn't it? Okay, so it's working class.
Next words, drawing room, sitting room, or lounge?
I wouldn't say any of those. I'd normally say living room.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I would say living room. But which do you think is posher? Drawing room, sitting room, or lounge?
Well, drawing room and sitting room sound pretty posh to me, and lounge sounds working class.
Right.
More than that, it sounds working class 1970s. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of George and Mildred, or as the Spanish call them, Los Roper. When I hear lounge, yeah, it's a 1970s working class sitting room for me.
Yeah, and my parents actually used lounge quite often. Let's go into the lounge, or let's sit down in the lounge. So again, reflecting their working class roots. So drawing room, sitting room, more upper class, and lounge is more lower class.
And what's more, like my parents, your parents were at their peak probably in the 1970s.
Yep. Exactly. And in the lounge or sitting room, you would find a sofa or maybe a settee. Which do you think is working class, which is upper class? Sofa or settee?
I know settee, which is what I say is more working class.
Yeah, same here. Settee is SETTEE. So I would also use the word sofa, but sofa would be more connected to upper class English and settee to lower class English. Interesting. So would you like to change your social class? We've both agreed that we come from upper working class backgrounds, or maybe lower middle class, perhaps. Would you like to go up to upper class?
No, but I don't want to go down either. I just want to take life as it comes. I think I kind of am where I am because that's where I should be. It doesn't really bother me. What about you?
You feel comfortable in your class then?
I do, yes. What was much harder to get used to for me was the idea that I wasn't a purebred. If people remember Jose's story, he talked about the mongrel dog who wasn't a purebred. So for me, race is a trickier question because most people say the name, they have a certain appearance, and you think, oh, he's British or she's Spanish or he's Argentinian or whatever. But with me, I've got a name which is not typical in the English-speaking world, but I was brought up in the English-speaking world. But my father is from India, as I said, from a well-off, that means comfortable, family with a bit of money. And my mom's with the British side or the Irish side, Northern Irish, who didn't have that much money, actually. So I'm a bit of a weird mixture myself. And it's not so much the class, but as the ethnicity, which I think is trickier to deal with.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, well, I don't have that in my genes, in my makeup, but I used to feel very self-conscious of my background because I said before I grew up in a suburb of London, but in the county of Essex, and Essex people have a particular reputation of not being particularly well educated, of not going to university, which is also what happened in my case. So I felt for many years very self-conscious and very aware of the way I spoke and my class and my background. Now, these days, I feel very comfortable with it. And I don't have that problem or that stigma of my class.
Yeah, for me, I would love the world to be full of classless societies. I would love the Indian caste system to disappear. I think it's a terrible thing.
Me too.
And causes misery. And the British class system is ridiculous as well. I wish it would just collapse. Mind you, it causes a lot of fun as well. It's good to generate humor and jokes and sketches on comedy shows. It's very inspiring, but it's a pretty awful idea, really, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't know if you remember growing up, the BBC for many years representing Britain had almost all their presenters speaking with the RP accent, like the Queen, this very clipped, proper upper class accent. But in recent years, in fact, the last 10, 15 years, there have been many more varied accents on the BBC, people from all over the UK, Scottish, Newcastle, Birmingham accents, Welsh accents, Irish accents, all different classes represented on the BBC, which makes me feel a lot more comfortable with my own accent, my own voice.
I couldn't help, that means I couldn't avoid, it was too much temptation, slipping in a final question because Craig knows what I'm getting at before I ask it. Is there any race of people, Craig, where snobbery seems more prevalent than others, in your opinion?
You mean like a superior race? Any country that think they're more... Not really. I think most people...
Well, hold on. No, I don't mean that. I chose my words very carefully.
Okay.
Is there any race of people where snobbery seems more prevalent? That doesn't mean that everybody's a snob, but it means there are a lot of snobs.
I would say the UK.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to... In fact, if you don't mind, I'm going to say England.
Okay. Yeah, I'd agree with that too. Yeah, more so than Scotland and Ireland, yeah.
Even within the UK, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, it's not gospel truth. Can't say it's 100% true. But particularly in England, not everyone is a snob, not at all. And there are reverse snobs and everything. But there are an awful lot of snobs in England compared to Spain, for example, or other countries that I know. There are a lot of people who do like the idea of a class system in the UK.
Is there a class system in Spain? And if there is, where are we?
Giddies. Sorry, for South Americans, gringos. It's kind of
Gringos, yeah.
Another group.
Subsect.
Yeah. I think there's much less class distinction in Spain.
Definitely.
Yeah. I think that.
And I think it's more divided by money than education.
Money, and you know what? Crazily, politics. For older people, not for younger people. But older people, Spain in the countryside. Have you spent much time in a pueblo? in the middle of nowhere in Spain. Everybody knows everybody else's politics, the ideology, and there's a lot of este era un rojo, este un facha. For old people, there's a lot of obsession in Spain. They know your ideology, and that means a lot to old people. It's disappearing as the old people die. But of course, they had a civil war here. It was a clash of ideologies. And I still notice that in the pueblos here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you're interested in this idea of the British class system and you would like to know what class you are, I did find on a BBC webpage a class calculator. So there are some questions that you answer, and at the end it tells you what class you are in Britain. And the questions ask about your income, how much money you earn every year, whether your house or flat is rented or owned. So do you live in rented accommodation or do you own your own place? If you have any savings in the bank, for example, if you have stocks and shares, acciones, and who you know socially, who your friends are, who you hang out with, a phrasal verb to hang out, to spend your time with. Do you tend to hang out with scientists and university lecturers or shop assistants and lorry drivers? That also determines your social class. And what you do in your spare time, what music you listen to, if you do arts and crafts, for example, go to the opera, or whether you just stay at home and socialize with your friends and watch sports on television. So if you're interested in this and you'd like to find out your class from a British perspective, you can find the link to that in the show notes at inglespodcast.com/216. I've also included a YouTube video in the show notes with some British comedians. It's very short, just a couple of minutes, which talks about the class system in a humorous way. And you've got the phrasal verbs in this video to look up to and to look down on someone. What do they mean, Reza?
So to look up to is admire, admirar, and to look down on is the opposite, menospreciar.
And there's another expression, to have innate breeding, that's used in the video. Innate breeding is crianza innata. So go and have a laugh at the British in that video, and I hope you'll find it funny. Now it's your turn to practice your English. So how is your part of the world socially divided? Is there a class system in your country? We would love to hear from you. We would love to know. So please send us feedback on this, and you can do that by going to speakpipe.com/inglespodcast and leaving your voice message there, or send us an email with your audio file attached in MP3 and send that to me, Craig, at inglespodcast.com.
Or belfastreza@gmail.com.
And before we say goodbye, we would like to thank our wonderful sponsors. Reza, who are they?
Well, first of all, many thanks to our gold sponsor on Patreon, that's Bruno. He organizes walking tours of Copenhagen through his company CopenhagenWalkingTour.com in both English and Spanish. He also organizes walking tours of the favela in Rio de Janeiro. Have a look at favelawalkingtour.com.br. It's a safe tour. It's organized by locals, and they know what they're doing and where they're going. And we'd also like to thank all our other wonderful patrons who are supporting the podcast with their donations. They are Ana Giovanna, Dana Constantin, Pachi Ibañez, Manuel Tarazona, Juan Carlos Rodado, Maite Palacín Pérez, Lara Arlem, Nestor from Luces Extrañas, María Gervate, Lorena, Sara Jarabo, Carlos Garrido, Mamen, Juan Leiva Galera, Corey Finneran from ivenv.com, Miren Full, José Luis Arregui, Agus Paulucci, Mariel Riedemann, Manuel García Petegón, Raúl López, Rafael, José Manuel Fernández Picazo, Pilar Martínez, Gambate Blog, Igor Garmendia, Ignacio Espona, Kieran, Ana Ibarra, Marina Ortiz Pena, Juan Carlos Pantín Fernández, Alejandra Pluma, Alex Cuadra, José Emilio Villena, Esperanza Colmenero, Emilio Manuel Martínez Rivas, Chema Santa Cruz, Ana Fernández Monterrubio, Carlos Cano Domingo, Gustavo Antonio Díaz, José Antonio Muñoz, Eva María Elizalde Martínez, Arminda Fafo, Carlos Sánchez, Elvira Cortés, Francisco Javier Alejandro Sebastián, and our latest new patrons, Andrea Mio, Rogelio Menéndez, Antonio Lafuente, Eloy, Pablo Martínez, Miguel, Javier Correa Zambade, Alejandro Martinez, Alejandro Ventura, and I think that's the lot, isn't it, Craig?
Yes, our list is getting longer and longer every week, which is something that we both really, really love because that means more people are supporting us and appreciating what we do. And we will continue reading all of those names and all the new sponsors that join us on Patreon because we think it's very important that you hear how much we appreciate you. You can join our program for $1 per month, and with that you get instant access to recent transcriptions of the podcast, which are lovingly transcribed by Angelica Bello from Madrid. If you want to join that list, go to patreon.com/Ingles podcast, and thank you very much for your support. Also, thank you to Patricia Alonso, who continues working hard to transcribe episodes for you. Actually, not only Patricia, but in the past we've had others helping us, like Arminda from Madrid and Alberto from Granada. So thank you for doing that. And we now have 3 on the website, episodes 1 to 22 and episodes 131 to 142. Reza, what's next week?
On next week's episode, top 10 fish you should know.
Okay, so join us next week for a very fishy episode. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.